He brought me coffee, but what he woke inside me was far stronger than caffeine. The first thing I noticed was the smell, warm, earthy coffee drifting through the quiet apartment, mixing with the faint scent of her vanilla-scented candle. It was too early for surprises, yet there he was, leaning slightly against the doorway, holding 2 steaming cups. His eyes caught mine with a quiet kind of recklessness, as if he knew exactly the effect his presence had, even while trying to appear casual. If you like my story, then subscribe my channel. I took the cup he offered, noticing the warmth seep into my fingers before our hands brushed ever so slightly. That brief contact, nearly accidental, left an unexpected shiver crawling along my spine. The sunlight spilling through the curtains caught strands of her hair, illuminating a softness I hadn't dared to notice before. Stepping inside. There was a grace to her movements, even in the ordinary, folding a newspaper, tucking a curl behind her ear, that made the room feel alive. He didn't rush, didn't speak too quickly, but each pause, each small gesture, seemed deliberate. I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders relax as our eyes met again. And I realized, the coffee was only a pretext. The real warmth I craved was in this proximity, the quiet space we shared, the tension that neither of us yet knew how to name. She sipped the coffee slowly, almost contemplatively, and I took a careful step closer, careful not to cross an invisible line that neither of us had defined. I watched her notice the little things, a faint smudge of cream on her lip, a stray lock of hair, the curve of her smile, and I felt my own heartbeat hitch in response. There was an intimacy in the mundane, the ordinary, that seemed almost dangerous in its quiet potency. The conversation started lightly, small talk about the weather, the city, the unremarkable hum of the morning, but the pauses carried weight. I found myself noticing the way her eyes lingered on mine, the way her fingers tightened briefly around her cup, the way her breathing seemed to synchronize with mine when the silence stretched. Everything felt amplified. Every glance, every subtle movement, was electric in its restraint. Time slowed. The morning light shifted across the apartment, shadows moving over her face, highlighting the faint laugh lines at the corners of her eyes. There was a kind of vulnerability there, carefully veiled, that called to something protective in me. Yet, there was also a quiet confidence, a life fully lived, in the way she moved, the way she existed in her space without apology. By the time the coffee was nearly gone, I realized I was no longer thinking about caffeine. I was thinking about the way she made me aware of my own emotions in a way I hadn't expected. A simple gesture, a hand brushing against mine, a lingering look, had woken something inside me, and I knew the morning had changed me before it had even truly begun. The morning had settled into a quiet rhythm. The coffee cups were half empty now, leaving a faint ring of warmth on the table, and the city beyond the window hummed softly, unaware of the tension in our little corner of the world. Conversation began lightly, the casual talk of mundane things, traffic, errands, the weather, but it didn't stay casual for long. I found myself leaning in slightly as she spoke, noticing the way her hands moved gracefully over the cup, the way her voice carried a gentle cadence, a rhythm that somehow made me forget the words themselves. There was a weight to her presence, a quiet gravity that drew attention without demanding it. And I realized, with a kind of startled clarity, that every story she told, every little detail she shared, felt like an invitation to understand her more deeply than I had ever understood anyone before. Her laugh was soft, almost hesitant, but genuine, and when she laughed, her eyes crinkled in a way that made me want to memorize every line. I caught myself noticing the subtle curve of her neck, the way the sunlight brushed across her shoulder, and I shook off the awareness quickly, chiding myself for thinking too much about the ordinary. But the ordinary wasn't ordinary here, it was charged, alive. She noticed me watching, of course. There was a flicker of amusement in her expression, a hint of something unspoken that made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach across the table, to touch her hand lightly, to reassure her that I was present, that I was listening, not just to her words but to the spaces between them. The small gestures of proximity mattered, a cup shifted closer, a knee brushing slightly under the table, the way we leaned toward each other without consciously trying. Every story she told carried nuance, the weight of experience, and I responded with care, matching my observations to hers. I asked questions, not invasive, just enough to show interest, and noticed how her eyes softened when she realized I genuinely wanted to know her. There was a delicate dance in our conversation, a give and take that neither rushed nor forced intimacy but allowed it to grow naturally, like sunlight filtering slowly through leaves. At one point, our hands brushed again, the contact lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. She didn't pull away, and neither did I. Instead, we let it hang, a subtle acknowledgement that our closeness had shifted the energy in the room. It was not bold, it was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. By the time the second cup of coffee was empty, the ordinary had transformed. I felt tethered to her in a way I hadn't anticipated, the kind of connection that isn't loud or dramatic but is felt deep in the chest, in the pulse of a shared silence. The conversation had done more than fill time, it had revealed layers, unspoken truths, and a delicate, mutual curiosity that neither of us was ready to name aloud. And so we sat there, two people drawn together by small touches, lingering looks, and the soft rhythm of a conversation that had become more than words. I knew, even then, that this morning would linger in my mind long after the coffee cooled, leaving me awake to feelings I hadn't expected and a curiosity I couldn't ignore. The coffee mugs had long since been cleared away, leaving only the faint lingering aroma of roasted beans in the air, mingling with the soft warmth of the morning sunlight. Neither of us felt the need to fill the silence with words. Instead, we found ourselves walking through the quiet streets, the city still stretching itself awake around us. There was something in the simplicity of it, the way our footsteps fell almost in rhythm, the occasional rustle of leaves from a passing breeze, that made the world shrink until it consisted of nothing but the two of us. His presence beside me was comforting yet disorienting. I noticed the way his shoulder brushed against mine as we turned a corner, an almost accidental contact that left my chest tingling long after it happened. I didn't speak, and neither did he, yet there was a conversation in every glance, every half-smile, every subtle shift of his posture. His eyes occasionally flicked to mine, and in those brief moments, I felt seen in a way that was disarming. It was as if he could perceive the weight of unspoken thoughts, the quiet hesitations I carried with me, and acknowledge them without judgment. The sun climbed higher, casting golden patches across the pavement. I caught the reflection of his profile in a shop window, strong lines softened by the warmth in his expression, and I realized that the silence between us was not empty. It was laden with anticipation, curiosity, and something more tender, something unacknowledged yet undeniable. A light drizzle began, soft enough to be playful, enough to make us huddle closer. His arm brushed against mine again, this time lingering just a moment longer. My heart stuttered, not in fear, but in awareness, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement of the tension coiling quietly between us. I felt the warmth of his body even through layers of clothing, the subtle reassurance of his nearness, and I resisted the urge to turn fully toward him. Not yet. There was power in waiting, in letting the moment stretch without forcing it. We paused under the awning of a small café, watching raindrops bead on the glass. He looked at me, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. There was no need for words. The slightest tilt of his head, the softening of his gaze spoke volumes. The subtle electricity between us was palpable, the kind that simmers quietly, unnoticed by the world but undeniable to those caught within it. As the drizzle subsided, we continued walking, our steps unhurried. Every brush of our hands, every accidental touch, felt deliberate without being forced. The silence became a language in itself, a slow, measured exchange that carried more weight than any sentence could. By the time we returned to the apartment, I realized that the morning had shifted something inside me. The conversation over coffee had built a foundation, but this shared silence had cemented it, creating a space where trust, curiosity, and desire could exist without labels. I felt awake in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine, alert to every nuance of his presence, every possibility the day could bring, and every quiet, lingering moment we had yet to share. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft amber light across the living room. We had settled onto the couch, still holding remnants of the morning's quiet energy, but now the conversation had taken on a different weight. She set her cup down and leaned back, her posture betraying a rare moment of ease, or perhaps hesitation. I watched her closely, careful not to crowd her space, yet aware that the smallest gesture, an inch closer, a brush of fingers, could speak volumes. "I haven't really talked about this in a while," she said softly, her voice carrying both restraint and vulnerability. Her eyes flicked down, tracing invisible patterns on the fabric of the couch. There was a pause, pregnant with anticipation, and I realized she was weighing every word, measuring whether I was someone who could listen without judgment. I leaned in slightly, letting my presence be reassuring without intrusive. "I'm listening," I said simply, feeling the weight of those 3 words as an anchor for her trust. She began slowly, telling me about a heartbreak from years ago, about choices made and regrets carried in quiet corners of her mind. Her voice trembled only briefly, then steadied as if she were testing the waters of honesty. Every sentence was punctuated by tiny gestures, a hand resting over her heart, a sigh that seemed to carry the memory of old wounds. I noticed the subtle changes in her expression, the tightening around her eyes when the memory stung, the softening of her lips when she found a comforting thought. I wanted to reach out, to place my hand lightly on hers, to offer silent reassurance, but I paused, letting the tension exist without interference. And yet, instinctively, my hand hovered near hers, the air between us charged by possibility. The brush of fingers against the armrest, the nearly imperceptible leaning toward her, carried more intimacy than words ever could. Her gaze met mine then, fleeting but intense. It wasn't just about her past, it was about allowing someone in, trusting them with the fragile pieces of oneself. I felt a protective warmth rise, the kind that makes you want to be steadfast, dependable, and wholly present. When she glanced down again, I let my fingers drift, brushing her hand lightly. She didn't pull away, and the simple contact seemed to ease the tension, allowing her voice to flow more naturally. I realized then that the slow-burn tension between us wasn't about romance alone. It was about trust, about the courage to be seen fully, and the courage to hold space for another's vulnerabilities. Every laugh she allowed, every hesitant smile, became a subtle dance of intimacy. We were inching closer emotionally, the kind of closeness that doesn't demand, that doesn't rush, but grows with patience and attentiveness. By the time the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, something unspoken had shifted. The air between us carried the warmth of shared honesty, the quiet promise of understanding, and the subtle tension of desire restrained by respect. The coffee, the morning walk, and this gentle confession had all built toward a fragile, yet undeniable connection, one that neither of us had to name aloud, yet both of us felt deeply. The evening air carried a gentle chill as we stepped into the small gathering of friends. The space was warm, filled with muted laughter, the clink of glasses, and the hum of conversation. Yet, amid the ordinary noise, I couldn't ignore the weight of our proximity, the way every glance we exchanged seemed magnified under the social spotlight. She moved with quiet confidence, navigating the room with the ease of someone used to being seen yet rarely scrutinized. But I noticed a slight hesitancy in her steps, a subtle tightening of her shoulders whenever someone's attention lingered too long. I felt an odd protectiveness rise in me, not possessive, but a desire to shield her from unnecessary scrutiny, to maintain the fragile intimacy we'd been cultivating. The tension wasn't overt, it was in the small moments. When she reached for a plate of snacks, our hands brushed, and I felt the familiar shiver, electric yet restrained. She caught my gaze and smiled softly, a private acknowledgement in the midst of public attention. It was our secret language, quiet but potent, and it only heightened the desire simmering beneath the surface. I noticed the subtle judgments of others, some curious, some amused. But I also saw how gracefully she deflected them, how she held her composure without revealing the vulnerability she allowed me to witness earlier. The contrast made the pull between us even more tangible. Here, in a world of social expectations and whispers, our connection existed in a space just for us, a tension unspoken but undeniably real. At one point, a friend made a light-hearted comment about the apparent age difference between us. I felt a flicker of discomfort, a hesitation that mirrored her own internal conflict. She shifted slightly closer, just enough for our shoulders to brush. That tiny contact anchored me. In that simple gesture, I felt reassurance, a shared understanding. We didn't need to explain ourselves to anyone else. Our connection, though unconventional to some eyes, was ours to explore cautiously and deliberately. I watched her laugh at another friend's joke, noticing the way her eyes sparkled despite the subtle tension. Every glance in my direction, every micro-expression, spoke volumes. Desire and hesitation danced quietly between us, a careful balance of longing and respect. The social setting, which might have been a distraction, only heightened the slow burn, making every subtle touch, every brush of our hands under the table, feel like a confession in miniature. By the time the evening wound down, we found ourselves on the balcony, away from the murmurs of the party. The city lights shimmered below, and the gentle breeze carried a promise of quiet. Here, away from observation, we allowed ourselves the brief luxury of proximity, our hands lingering together, shoulders brushing, and eyes meeting with unspoken understanding. This night crystallized something vital. Desire was no longer theoretical. It existed quietly but firmly, restrained by the world around us, yet impossible to ignore. The slow-burn tension had reached a critical point, an emotional crossroads where awareness of the outside world collided with the inevitability of attraction. And in that collision, we discovered something neither of us could deny. The connection we shared was worth navigating carefully, patiently, and fully. The evening had deepened into a quiet, almost sacred stillness. The apartment was dimly lit, shadows soft against the walls, and the faint hum of the city beyond the windows felt distant, as if it belonged to another world. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the remnants of dinner between us, yet neither of us seemed focused on food. Instead, the space between us was charged, every glance and breath weighted with anticipation. He reached for a cup of coffee, his fingers brushing mine as he handed it over. The contact lingered longer than necessary, deliberate yet subtle. I felt warmth radiate from his touch, a steady reassurance that countered the fluttering tension in my chest. There was an intimacy in the simplicity of the gesture, nothing spoken, but everything conveyed. We talked softly, carefully. The conversation was mundane on the surface. Plans for the week, small anecdotes. But underneath, every pause, every hesitation, carried meaning. His eyes didn't just see me, they traced my expressions, reading the flicker of emotion behind each word. I felt exposed in the best way possible, seen, acknowledged, and valued. When I laughed at one of his understated jokes, he leaned closer, his shoulder brushing mine lightly. The contact sent a ripple of warmth through me, and for a moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. I noticed the gentle curve of his mouth, the faint tension in his jaw as he watched me, waiting, curious. I felt a pull toward him, quiet but insistent, and I realized that every subtle gesture, the leaning in, the quiet attentiveness, the shared silences, was a dialogue more powerful than words could capture. The turning point came without grand declarations. A pause in conversation stretched, the kind that feels infinite, and he let his hand rest near mine on the table. I didn't move away. Instead, I allowed my fingers to brush against his, a fleeting, deliberate touch that spoke of desire restrained yet undeniable. The slow burn of weeks, the coffee, the walks, the confidences shared, culminated in this single, delicate acknowledgement of something deeper. Outside, the city lights glittered like scattered stars. The faint breeze through the slightly open window carried the scent of rain-soaked pavement. Every sense was heightened, the warmth of his presence, the subtle scent of his cologne, the sound of our breaths in quiet rhythm. I leaned slightly, and he mirrored me, the space between us shrinking naturally. A soft smile passed between us, unspoken understanding in our eyes. The tension was no longer just possibility, it was recognition. The beauty of it was in its restraint. There were no hurried gestures, no dramatic confessions. Just the quiet intimacy of proximity, the comfort of shared trust, and the thrill of desire acknowledged without forcing its pace. For the first time, I allowed myself to simply be present with him, aware of every small movement, every subtle shift, every heartbeat in shared time. By the end of the evening, something had shifted irrevocably. The slow burn, nurtured through quiet moments and subtle touches, had reached a point where both of us understood the depth of what we felt. There was no need for grand gestures. The warmth, the attentiveness, and the gentle acknowledgement of longing were enough. The turning point was not dramatic, it was intimate, tender, and profoundly human. The city had quieted into the gentle hum of late evening. Lights flickered from apartment windows across the street, painting the room in a mosaic of soft gold and muted shadows. We found ourselves back on the couch, the earlier tensions and hesitations now replaced by a calm awareness of each other's presence. There was no rush to speak, no urgency to define what had grown between us. Instead, the intimacy of the moment spoke louder than words ever could. I watched her just slightly, leaning back comfortably, and I noticed the way her eyes softened when she realized I was watching, not with judgment, but with quiet admiration. Her hand rested lightly on the arm of the couch, and instinctively, I let mine drift closer, fingertips grazing hers. The contact was fleeting, but it carried the weight of acknowledgement, a delicate promise that whatever this connection was, it was real, mutual, and cherished. The warmth of the apartment, the lingering scent of coffee and rain from earlier walks, seemed to cocoon us from the world outside. Every small gesture mattered, the way her shoulder brushed mine when she shifted, the tilt of her head as she caught my gaze, the soft laugh that escaped her lips when a shared memory surfaced. Even silence felt purposeful, each pause in conversation a space where trust and affection could settle naturally between us. I reached for her hand, letting it rest fully in mine. She didn't pull away. Instead, she intertwined her fingers with mine, the subtle pressure a testament to the comfort and safety we had built together. There was a thrill in the slow acknowledgement of desire, tempered by respect and understanding. Every touch, every glance, was amplified by the journey we had taken, from the accidental coffee delivery to this quiet, shared evening of understanding and closeness. We leaned closer, shoulders touching, heads almost resting against each other. I brushed a strand of hair from her face, my fingers lingering at her cheek, feeling the warmth and the softness of her skin. She smiled, a mixture of shyness and familiarity, and I realized that the slow-burn tension of the past days had blossomed into something steady, comforting, and wholly ours. There was no need for grand confessions. The intimacy was in the small details, in the shared glances and touches that spoke more than words ever could. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the night sky, a silent witness to the delicate connection we had nurtured. Inside, the room felt alive with quiet laughter, soft words, and the gentle rhythm of our breathing. The age difference, the initial hesitation, the social expectations, all of it melted away in the warmth of this shared space. What remained was pure, human, and profoundly tender, two people allowing themselves to be fully present with each other. By the time we finally moved to part ways for the night, there was a sense of completion, not in a dramatic finale, but in a quiet, satisfying affirmation. The slow burn had reached its natural conclusion, emotions acknowledged, intimacy shared, and hearts aligned. I knew that tomorrow would bring new moments, new shared experiences, but tonight, the connection we had built was enough. It lingered in our touch, in our glances, and in the unspoken understanding that some bonds need no declaration, only presence, patience, and care. The warmth of that night, the quiet fulfillment of long-awaited emotional closeness, left me awake in the most unexpected, yet comforting, way.